And we're live.
Yay!
Woo!
So, hey everyone, it's Stephanie, and welcome back to my channel. So, today we're here to talk about Notes from a Dead House by Fyodor Dostoevsky. So, to start off, do we want to introduce our channels?
Sure.
So, Kate, do you want to go first?
I'll go first, sure. I'm Kate from the Literary Apothecary, and I read just about everything in a given month. Fantasy, sci-fi, classics, nonfiction, anything that people throw at me, any kind of buddy read that's out there, I'm game for. So, and I really, 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 really loved this book. I think this is my favorite Dostoevsky yet, so.
Very cool. Well, my name is Una, and I am the one that did not write my channel name in the description. That would have been a good idea. I'm from the Codex Cantina. We do a lot of classics and literary fiction, and we love to sprinkle in a lot of genre, horror, and fantasy here every so often to break things up. So it's not all suffering and sadness that we get. All right, Christy.
Hi, I'm Christy Lewis from the channel Christy Lewis, Dostoevsky in Space, and I just really love all these people, so I'm thrilled to be here talking about one of my very favorite authors, and yeah, I loved this book, so I can't wait to talk about it.
Awesome. Sorry, my screen blipped. So, to start off, this was my second time reading it, but I didn't remember anything. But I think everyone else, it was your first time. So did you have any expectations going in?
I expected great characters because Dostoevsky always has amazing characters, but beyond that, I mean, I knew the general premise that it was prison lit and he had taken notes during his time in prison in Siberia from all the prisoners that he met there and then wrote this after he got out. But beyond that, I didn't really have, of course, it's Russian lit with Dostoevsky, so there's going to be suffering and pain. But beyond all, the classic Dostoevsky stuff, I had no more expectations going into it.
I will say going into it, so I also knew the exact same things, right? Prison lit, Dostoevsky, so amazing characters. I went through a brief period where I was like, in prison lit, never Russian. So this was going to be my first foyer into that. And always the prison lit just seems very political or social. And I was genuinely surprised. I enjoyed my experience. I was genuinely surprised how it was so much more personable, so much more about the psychology of the people. I think there's social commentary there, of course, but I was genuinely surprised how he pulled back and spent so much time on us to see what people went through in these situations in this time period. So I thought that was really, really surprising and cool.
Yeah, it was so personal. I was just listening to some of the Voxers in our Voxer group, and Kate was saying, people actually thought that Dostoevsky went to the work camp because he murdered his wife, because that's how personal it feels.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think it was part of the footnotes in here somewhere that said Dostoevsky, after this was published, he had to continuously say I took these stories from people I met in prison, but I am not the main character. I did not murder my wife like this character did, and I was not in prison for this reason.
Yeah. Well, they say that's a big fallacy when you're a reader, is the biological fallacy, is to take everything and apply it to the author. Yep. But it's also really hard when you know that this is a semi-autobiographical work. You know these are people that he meets. I'm constantly inserting myself to think this narrator, I wouldn't say Dostoevsky did besides the crime, I don't think he was characterized enough where it's just like, this is clearly not Dostoevsky. Like,
Right.
there just wasn't much time spent on the narrator himself.
Well, and I think it gives testament to Dostoevsky's characters just in themselves, that they can be so lifelike and real that people think that they're actually real people and this is a piece of nonfiction.
Mhm.
Because it takes a lot for a writer of any kind at any time to be able to make characters feel so realistic that people think they're real people.
Now, maybe we should start with this question too. How much Dostoevsky background do each of us have? I imagine I'm on the lower end here because I've only done Brothers Karamazov. I've only done Crime and Punishment. Just reread both of those as well. And now this would be technically my third right before we kick off The Idiot here next month.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm on the lower end in terms of my Dostoevsky experience. What have you guys all read just from like a background perspective?
Same as you. This is
Same.
my third Dostoevsky.
Okay.
I've probably read even less than you guys because I didn't do any background research besides what was given to me in the introduction and the preface of my edition. But now I want to go and read even more Dostoevsky.
Yeah. This is my fourth because I've read The Idiot, but it's been a very long time. And the Brothers Karamazov and Crime and Punishment.
Oh, that's interesting. I think it's my fourth too, because I have not read The Idiot, but I've read Notes from the Underground, which I have gotten confused with this one for a long time until Stephanie had it on her reading list, and I was like, "What is this? Is this something different?"
Well, and even
so different too, because sometimes it's House of the Dead, sometimes it's Notes
Yeah.
from a Dead House.
Yeah.
And same thing with like his demons. It's sometimes translated as the possessed. And like, sometimes like I'll get comments on like like I had this video where I put up a graphic of different books of his, and I'll get comments from people like, "Hey, those are the same two books." I'm like, I know, I thought the covers looked pretty. Like,
Yeah,
but yeah,
that.
it does get confusing.
I think it all depends on the translation, and that's why
Yes.
there's different variants of titles.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, then, Christy, you've been learning like the alphabet too, I think. My wife and I were talking about that. So my wife and I, we went to a farm this morning, and on the drive, we were talking about Anna Karenina because we're both reading that. And we were talking about the name Alexei and how it's sometimes translated as EI and sometimes as EY. And, we were kind of debating like, well, is this the same character? Like it's spelled differently here. And I'm like, well,
I'll look it up.
like
I don't know how it's spelled in
characters
Russian.
just don't translate the exact same every single time, that there is, variance. So, in the grand scheme of as
Fyodor
we read,
Dostoevsky, translated different ways all the time.
so as we read The House of the Dead too, which sometimes denotes from a dead house, there might be differences in maybe how we
Right.
interpreted the words on the page too.
Or even like in Brothers Karamazov, one character had 5 different names, or several different names, maybe not 5, but each character had many different names in the same book talking about the same character depending on the circumstance and who they're talking to and around. So it could very well be the same character or different characters with the same name.
Russian words change spelling all the time depending on their context within the sentence. So yeah, I guess names do the exact same thing. So with different rules, obviously. It can't be all the same. That would be too easy.
So what are some of the big differences you guys think this book has as opposed to some of the other novels of his? Like one of the things that I took away from this being Notes from a Dead House is this did feel like notes. It did feel like vignettes of characters. We're talking about character names. I actually thought the character names were easier. Like we only got kind of one name as opposed to novels. You have, to your point, you were saying earlier, 3-5 names sometimes
Right.
that they're called based on how well you know them and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
The character names were much easier to absorb, but we spent less time because they were very quick sketches of people, of stories that he probably heard while in his work prison. Would you say that his characters in this were definitely much more I don't know if I want to say the word focus, but we had less time with them. And as a result, it was very brief that the characters, I don't want to say ran together, but we didn't explore them as much, I would say, in this work as opposed to some of his other writing.
Yeah. And I felt like even though Dostoevsky uses a lot of characters in all of his works that I've read, because each one of these characters had very different names from each other, whereas in other works, a lot of them had a lot of similarities to their names. It felt like there was a lot more characters in this book than in some of the other books that I've read. And it did, because there were so many and they were all in essentially the same situation, a lot of them did kind of meld into each other for me, and I had to kind of go back and reread parts and pull them out and say, okay, this character is this character is this. And it was interesting to go back and try to figure out who was who and what situations.
Yeah, I think they were all, which I can't remember if Russian does this, but all like informal with each other. It's not like
Probably.
Yeah, so maybe
did they
that's
refer
why
to
there
him?
aren't as many names either.
What? That's a really good point. Do you guys remember what they referred to the main guy as? Because he was also a noble, like Dostoevsky.
Alexander Petrovich, I think.
Yeah. Did they called him by his, because I was wondering if it's different if you're nobility in prison, because he really felt like he was treated very differently from everybody else because he was a noble. So
and the king, right? Like they were both noblemen, and I kind of felt like both of them were not treated the same as what were peasant inmates would be. We call them inmates. I don't know the right terminology.
Convicts is what my translation said.
Yeah, and a lot of them were just one name too. They didn't have both names.
I wonder how much of that the censorship. I don't know if you guys, Kate, I've heard you mention a few times your forward. Mine talked about how when he was trying to get it through censors, he did have to change some things. And I guess the things that he said was, "You're making prison seem too glamorous." Like, like they didn't want people to start committing crime to go to prison to get like that quality of life. That was one
a fair point.
Not when trying to get it submitted.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
That definitely makes sense.
I think my favorite part in the whole book, though, was still the introduction written by Dostoevsky himself. It was when I first read it, I was like, this is an amazing love letter to Siberia. And he made it seem like it was just such a different view of Siberia than we usually get. We usually get the cold, desolation, lonely place where no one wants to go. There's no one there. It's empty and barren. And Dostoevsky just writes it in such a loving way that he's like, I have a quote written down from just page 3 that says, "In general, serving in Siberia, despite the cold, is extremely warm and snug." And you never hear those two words, warm and snug, when talked about in Siberia. And he just writes about Siberia in such a way. And he's like, if you spend time in Siberia, you can tell when someone spent time in Siberia because they talk about it in a totally different way than anyone who's never been to Siberia before. He's like, you can tell the people that are in the know versus people that just talk about it. And I don't know. It was an interesting juxtaposition compared to the rest of the book also, because we get like this whole, basically short essay on Siberia and how it's such a wonderful place to actually live. And if you know where all the places to be are in Siberia, and then we jump into prison and we don't see a lot of like Siberia itself throughout the rest of the book because it's so prison focused.
Just the blue sky outside the prison.
Right. Yeah. So it was interesting to get this introduction written by Dostoevsky himself, and then we go into the rest of the book, which is mainly just in prison.
Why do you think that chapter exists? Do you think it was for the censors, or why do you think he would add this? I would describe it as poetic. It was
Yeah,
a love
definitely.
letter poetry to this time in his life.
Probably partly nostalgia for that time, and also kind of a note saying, you know, yes, we were in prison here, and the conditions within the prison were horrible, but outside of the prison is a lovely place. Siberia is not just this prison or these series of prisons. There's, you know, this whole country and this whole place aside from the prisons.
Yeah, because there's people that live there, and they
Right.
probably get sick of, like, when you say Siberia, they're like, "No, I wasn't in prison. I lived there."
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
they have to
And like some
constantly
of them,
defend where they
you know,
live.
some of the people that have lived in Siberia, as we've learned through this book, are people that have been released from the prison, and they have to go and do, you know, like their stay
like
after the
exiles
prison relief. Right.
from
But
Russia.
some people choose to stay in Siberia, and some people choose to go elsewhere for their time afterwards. And so some of
sometimes
the go ahead.
people follow prisoners there
Right.
to live there.
Yeah. Yeah. Their families and stuff.
That's like a whole population of people that, like, you see it in some of his characters in other books. Like, I don't want to name names because I don't want to spoil anybody, although everybody on this stream has read what I'm talking about. But there's a particular character that follows another particular character who ends up in a Siberian work camp, and you can see where he got that in this book. It's he saw it and experienced it, and he experienced love from these people who just wanted to bless the prisoners, you know.
Yeah.
They have it's like a special group of people who just really care about the convict, welfare. I keep saying prisoner.
That's probably my fault. I apologize for that.
No, I have to keep reminding myself.
Yeah, I loved the whole smuggling aspect of it. They had these designated people. They had like this whole system on smuggling contraband into the prison, and I loved seeing like what different characters had smuggled in, because it wasn't the same thing for everyone. And it was just so interesting learning that whole aspect of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's
Dostoevsky in his books. Go ahead, sorry.
About how this moment in Dostoevsky's life was monumental in changing him as a person, changing him as a writer, and probably giving him a deeper insight into people than he had before. So he definitely has that.
Mm-hmm.
I often wonder, how did he, because we got this whole book, and I still feel like I don't know for sure, how does Dostoevsky feel about this time in his life? Because as we all know, he was deeply religious, and I think he grew closer and closer. And there's something to be said about salvation and the idea of them going to prison and coming out different people, coming out where now they realized how they should look upon each other, how they should view grace, how they should view love for people, and what people want. To specifically coming back to your point about how they smuggled it in, people all wanted something different. Sometimes it was personal to them, books. Sometimes it was like, I want sweet meat. This is something, or not sweet meat, sweet bread, because this is what'll give me pleasure. And they'll even give up meat for bread, which I thought was kind of interesting. But it's all kind of like that idea of what will you sacrifice for? What will you give up? And what will you move your life towards, I guess, in a sense. And I think prison helped Dostoevsky find that for himself.
Mm-hmm.
And it also helped him kind of find happiness in life. In the foreword that I had, which was written by Richard Pevere in this edition, he quotes from a letter that Dostoevsky wrote to his brother while he was writing this book after he got out of prison. And he said, "Life is a gift. Life is happiness. Every moment could have been an age of happiness." And Dostoevsky goes on to expand that, you know, his time in prison has taught him how to appreciate kind of the small moments in life and just happiness in general, because you don't always get that.
And I think we see that in this book too.
Yeah.
The way he befriends like the dog, particularly the dog that nobody else loved.
Yeah.
And that dog could show affection. That dog could show love when he reaches out. And I thought that was kind of one of those very small, personable moments that Dostoevsky is very good at writing, because you can see how there are times in our own lives where we need to reach out to show that compassion and caring. And you can see the reward for us when we do that.
Yeah, this one was definitely reflective for me. Like, how would I feel if I were in this situation, or what would I want to sacrifice to get XYZ in prison? I think more than his other works that I've read. And maybe it's because this one's more personal. But it's definitely thought-provoking.
Yeah, like, oh, go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, you go.
Okay. Well, I was just going to say, like, he is constantly thinking about his place in the prison and how he's going to relate to prison work camp and how he's going to relate to all the convicts. And yeah, it's just he says it's being put in a totally different place that I have never even imagined. And yeah, so I think it's easy for us all to kind of think about that, because he's constantly doing that in this book. And yeah.
Did you guys find it funny at times too? Like, we've talked about the suffering, we've talked about the personable, like, did you find it funny as well?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Christy and Stephanie know from our last live stream that I didn't realize this about myself until we read The Return of the Sorcerer, but I laugh at the like weirdest parts where everyone else stuff. Is like, what? And I'm like,
I
laughing.
read these stories and I was terrified. And Kate was over here sending me boxes where she can barely get the words out because she's laughing. I'm like, that was so scary.
I think, like, for me in Notes from a Dead House, it was those moments where, like, things are entirely serious, obviously, because it's Dostoevsky and it's a work camp in Siberia and whatnot. But he has, like, this way with words to make those moments that could just be totally horrifying and devastating almost lighthearted. He's like, oh yeah, and then this happened, and then he just moves on very quickly. And just the way that he wrote them, like the prisoners, the prisoners getting half their head shaved made me laugh. And then it made me think, like, why is it, only half their head shaved, and why is it always the same side being shaved? And it kind of like made me laugh. It made lighthearted moments, but then it made me reflect on those moments afterwards.
Yeah, they were a nice, like, space to take a breath, and it's just not constantly horrific, horrible things. So it was a nice break.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, you're fine. That was it.
Okay. I think Dostoevsky and probably other Russian writers too know that in order to deal with suffering, you must also have laughter. A lot of times they coexist, very much so in like I'm rereading Crime and Punishment right now, and there's so many moments in there that are just like, and also there's so many funny moments. Like there's a funeral in that book that is like, the death of the person was just terrible. It's extremely sad and lamentable. And then the funeral is just like, it's like a carnival atmosphere. It's just ridiculous.
Yeah. I think my favorite part about that with this book, to both your guys' points, is when they're talking about how they restrained convicts, where they're like, oh, well, we hold them down and we beat them until they stop moving. And you're like, oh, well, that's really intense. And then they're talking about smuggling in vodka, to your guys' early points. Well, what do you do? Oh, we restrained them. It's cool. Presented
so matter-of-factly.
Yeah, yes. But it's gruesome and presented so flippant that it's funny. Like,
exactly.
He's very talented.
Like, this is how it was.
Yeah.
We
and like the Christmas. This Russian Christmas was not a happy Christmas.
No,
like by the end, it was terrible.
Right. But it was like at the beginning when he first started writing about the Christmas there, he's like, this is the one day of the year where everyone is friends, even if you don't want to be friends with them or they've never said anything to you this entire year. Like, you're all friends this year. Even with the guards, everyone is friends on Christmas, and like anything can go on Christmas. You can get anything you want on Christmas. And it just made it like he's like, yes, we're in this work camp and everything is horrible here. Circumstances are horrible, conditions are horrible, but at least we have this one day of the year where we can almost pretend that like we're not here, that everything is normal, and have like there's one prisoner, I forget his name, but like he requests like his normal Christmas meal that he would have outside of prison or the work camp, and I just
Right there.
appreciated that kind of normalness that you can tell the convicts really appreciated, that kind of one normal day, that special day. And then they'll go back the next day, they'll go back to their normal work camp conditions, but at least they have that one day to look forward to the rest of the year.
I think he even says it's like humor all over, and also everybody hates their life by the end of the day of Christmas. But it does start out like really fun for everybody.
Yeah. The other funny thing that I thought was funny was them faking mental breakdowns to get out of punishment, which is horrible. But at the same time, they're like, yeah, we just let them, do their thing, and then we threaten them with even more horrible punishment to get them to go out there. And then the one character that's like, I did my 1,000 lashes, and then I had a breakdown, and then I did more, and then I had a breakdown.
It made me wonder how did they, because he kind of explains it. There's like 3 chapters there in the hospital scene that he explains how they view doctors, and it's nothing like how we view doctors by today's standards. And I think was it 1855, somewhere around there, like Nicholas I, who was the Tsar at the time when he was in this work prison, he got sick. I think he refused to go even see a doctor as well. So I think, if I recall correctly, he passed away because he didn't want to see a doctor. And that's just very different from, I think, how we view physicians today specifically.
Yeah, the peasants that were in there, some of them really loved the doctor. I can't remember now. There was like 2 different views of doctors. There was peasants who really loved the doctors because the doctors treated them really well, like anybody they would have treated outside the prison. But then they also didn't trust the doctors with certain things.
Right.
And they would so
do it themselves. There was one quote that I took out from the hospital section that said, humanity, kindness, brotherly compassion for a sick man are sometimes more necessary to him than any medicine. And that just like hit me straight in the heart when I read that. That was like one of many moments while reading this book that I just had to like set it down and take a deep breath, take a break, and then get back into it. But it was just like the way that Dostoevsky writes, it just like captures those kinds of moments and those thoughts so well, where none of us have ever been in a Siberian prison before, a Siberian work camp, but we can relate to the characters in a way that you don't have to be in that exact situation to know how they're feeling.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm kind of glad I haven't been in a 19th century Siberian myself.
Yeah.
I don't think I would do well. I'll be honest.
I'd be in the hospital every day, like, oh, my back.
Well,
it
and
was
also
interesting. Go ahead.
I was just thinking, like, so one of probably the only thing aside of our love for books that I have in common with Dostoevsky is that we both suffered from epilepsy. And I wonder, we don't get any of that in here with his fictional writings, but I wonder how that played out in prison and how, you know, other prisoners dealt with that, and, you know, the hospital and the guards and stuff, because especially, you know, as you go further back in history, people don't know what epilepsy or seizures are. If you go far enough back, it's, you know, the work of the devil, and you're being, you know, taken over by these bad spirits and whatnot, and they use seances and, you know, exorcisms when they, especially when kids had epilepsy and seizures. And so I, knowing that I have that in common with the author and that he worked in a work camp like this, makes me wonder how he would, those, if he had episodes, if he had seizures while he was in the work camp, and how those were dealt with back then compared to how they would be dealt with today.
I think, Christy, you read that part of his biography, correct?
Yeah. How did they? I don't remember what it said about that. But yeah, I read the portion where he started getting them. Yeah.
I think it was
I don't
somewhere
remember
around.
though.
Yeah, just we'd have to have a look up to know for sure. But I think it was around this time that he was in prison that he started having these epileptic seizures.
Maybe around the time of his dad's murder. I'm not sure though.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I'll have to look it up, but
yeah. Good question. That, speaking of which, we were all working on that biography, that same biography, but it's pretty chunky.
Well, I just picked it up the other day, so I was like, okay, let's go see what it says about House of the Dead.
Yeah.
So, what was the most impactful scene for you in the book?
Stephanie?
That's hard. The one that like actually got an emotional response out of me was the ending. Just the last couple lines where he's finally like freedom, and how it means something different to different people was just, I might have cried.
Oh.
And you
setting off the shackles.
Yes.
How the characters all found like joys in different things in terms of what they wanted or smuggled in. We all have different ways of how we define that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think for sorry, go ahead. I was gonna say, I think for me it was the whole section I think on Christmas, just because of the way that he wrote about Christmas in the work camp, and that, you know, they even had like this extravagant performance that they did every year, and he wrote that, you know, this day was able to give the convicts hope that they didn't get on all the rest of the days. And I had several moments where I had to take a step back, or where I had goosebumps, and I, you know, had tears that came at a lot of different points. But I think that part about Christmas in the work camp was probably the most impactful to me, because that was the one moment where we saw hope for our characters.
Mm-hmm.
What about you, Christy?
Well, I know I was expecting all of you to be like, the Akulka chapter. So, is that what you're gonna say? Okay, good. I always get this anyway. So I wrote down a couple. All the stuff about the dogs in prison really just got me. Like, Dostoevsky's only friend, not Dostoevsky, the main character's only friend in prison is a dog, and nobody even cares about the dog. Nobody pets the Russian dog or feeds them or anything, but he is now best friends with this dog because nobody else wants to be his friend. It was just like, oh my gosh. And then all the prisoners just bringing in dogs for their skins. It's just like,
yeah.
So that really got me. And then again, when Dostoevsky was really trying to orient himself in this new world, I did like a vlog where I shared that quote, because it was just, yeah, it was really intense and interesting.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You know, I've been sitting here thinking, this just came to me just now, about where does this fit in his oeuvre, because we've already talked about some references to some of the books that we've read. I haven't read The Idiot yet, but I do know that there are some very specific parallels between a character in this and The Idiot. Talking about murdering pets and stuff, there's obviously a character in another Dostoevsky novel about that and such. This becomes more and more to me. I need to read more, obviously, Dostoevsky. My plan is every year, every winter, we're going to read something from him, right? Like that. I think that's going to be my schedule. This year's The Idiot. But I wonder, can we view this kind of like, if we look, okay, we're stepping way outside. Okay, we're leaving left field. We're leaving the ball game. Okay, we're going to go to the fantasy world. When we look at Tolkien, what did it take for him to create this world? Like, he went in on creating cultures.
Yeah.
And in order to achieve Lord of the Rings, in order to achieve The Hobbit, he created the Silmarillion, right? It's this background referential. This is the core experience and way that I'm going to structure my worlds that I build.
Yeah.
I wonder if it's not exactly that, but I wonder if there's ways that we can look at this book as Dostoevsky's Silmarillion, where we see little bits and pieces of these characters, why they behave the way they do when they suffer, how do they find reprieve, how do they find salvation. And you can almost see little bits of this in almost all of his works, from what I gather.
Yeah.
And I wonder if this is like, we talked about, like, would you make this your first Dostoevsky recommendation? Like, where do you start with Dostoevsky, right? And I think you can, but I also wonder, where does this fit in when it spirals out almost to all of his other books too?
Yeah. I think I would maybe not recommend it as a first Dostoevsky, but recommend it for those that are intimidated by some of his larger works, especially like Brothers Karamazov, because this feels much more accessible than the other two works I've read by him, and it's shorter, and the characters are easier to understand. So I wouldn't necessarily say, this should be everyone's first Dostoevsky read, but specifically for those that are like, well, I've always been intimidated by Russian lit and by Dostoevsky because his books are so big. When I talked to other people on reading sprints when I was reading this and whatnot, and they were like, well, should I read it? And I'm like, well, it depends on why you haven't read Dostoevsky yet. But this is, I would say, this is much shorter than a lot of his other books. It's much easier to understand and to relate to, and, to be able to keep track of what's going on, because you don't have those complex plot lines like you do in a lot of the other works, and it's not 1,000 pages long. It's only like 300 some. So I often recommend it to people as a starting place if they're intimidated by Dostoevsky.
Just like the Silmarillion, I would not recommend the Silmarillion to a beginner. But it's great background info.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like a central, like, if we look at the notes from A Dead House, this isn't a central narrative. This isn't about, he does weave in growth. He does weave in epiphanies and realizations, but it's not a tour de force per se of one focused idea. We're exploring life through the eyes of all of these people that end up in this spot, sometimes for the murder of people, sometimes for stealing, and they all end up in this pot of suffering. And it's interesting, but it's not the same structure as a novel, I would say.
It's more, I kind of took it more as almost character studies. Like, this is almost how he went and developed some of his later characters. Taking, a kernel from here and there and building a huge complex character out of it. I kind of took this more as, just character studies, because we get a lot of character exploration in this book versus, there's not really a solid plot line other than, the basic, you enter and you exit the work camp here. and everything that happens in between, there's not like a solid storyline, but there's so much that does happen in this, and that happens with all of the different characters that we meet and get to know.
Yeah, I described it as kind of episodic. Each chapter has its own beginning and end.
Yeah. You can almost mix and match perhaps some things where it didn't totally have to be in that order.
Yeah.
So I think I agree with Kate's first perspective that she was sharing about the it's a lot easier and shorter, and I actually thought it would be a good entry point if you're intimidated, by Dostoevsky. It's not like, it's kind of like what Una was saying too, like it's not really a central pillar of his oeuvre, however you say that word. But
something like that.
Yeah, something like that. Sean's tag introduced me to that word.
Me too.
Yeah, yeah, I would say definitely it's the perfect place to start if you're intimidated by Russian writers, because I think it will give you some background info and it'll kind of help you understand who Dostoevsky is, where he's coming from. It's kind of like this is like the source of so much of his writing and so much of himself. He really became who he was through experiencing this work camp, and I think that's what he's showing here.
Right. And I think, my Russian lit experience only extends to War and Peace by Tolstoy right now. Beyond that, I don't remember reading any other Russian lit as of right now. That'll change in the future, but as of right now, that's the extent of my Russian lit. But I think even thinking of War and Peace and everything that goes on in that ginormous book, this could be a good introduction to just kind of Russian lit in general, because you get a lot of the main themes that you get throughout Russian lit here in this book in a much more accessible way than our normal novels.
So Karen Richards asked, what year was this novel written? That was actually a focal point that we were just kind of talking about right before the stream, because we were kind of looking it up, because it was published in 1861, is that correct? Or 1860, around there.
61.
And according to the Frank biography, it had been written for 6 years. So he probably started writing it around 54 or 55, shortly after he was released, and didn't come out several years later.
Also, hi, Mom. And Christina.
Hi, Christina.
Yay. Yeah.
Stephanie's mom is legendary.
Yeah,
she's a hoot.
So should we ask the question that Crypto asked the other day? Could Dostoevsky have written such dynamic characterization had he lived today?
I think he definitely could, because that skill doesn't go away, but his characters definitely be different than they were when he wrote, if he wrote today. If you can follow that sentence at all, that was a weird sentence. I think his characters would be dynamic and as meaningful as they were, but just in a different way today, because there's different values and different experiences that they go through. But I think being able to write characters the way that Dostoevsky writes is a writing skill that a writer has to develop, and is circumstantial to the time. But I feel like Dostoevsky's writing would just because, this was written in the 1800s and we're still talking about it today in 2021. So I think his skill would transfer to today. They would be different characters, obviously, but I feel like they would still be as dynamic as they were back then. Sorry, that was a long answer explanation.
What do you think, Stephanie and Christina?
I agree, because I think just he's such a good writer, I think he would be able to, but I think it would be different. if that makes sense. Because it's back then you didn't have all the social media like Crypto was saying. You didn't have instant access to everything. So I think in-person interactions were more valued, maybe. But I was trying to think of other authors that are around now that I feel like would be prolific in the future. And I don't know how many would have the same impact as Dostoevsky has had for 200 plus years. So that was kind of convoluted, but I think he could. I think it might just be a little different, just depending on the circumstances and experiences, like Kate was saying.
Yeah, in general, Noah just shared the opinion on our Anna K live stream that like modern work, I guess, is, what did he say? He likes the characters better in more modern work, and I'm like totally the opposite. I think the characters are way better in older work, but obviously modern work, we're still filtering out what's going to be a classic, and I don't read enough of it. So honestly, I don't really know, but I do know that I think Dostoevsky has a bit of a tendency to kind of I think this experience in the prison kind of shattered his idea of so many stereotypes of what people were like, convicts, Russian peasantry, etc. I think because he was so interested in intellectual currents, sometimes he would just kind of generalize what people would be like. So he would need to have some kind of really it took an experience like this to make him the master of character work that he was, I think. But so his work just would have looked differently. I think he still would have had the genius, but he would have needed some really intense experiences in order to get him to the same level of character work, I think.
Yeah, I think we would have like maybe a handful of very dynamic characters, but not as many as, you know, it feels like in every one of his works, almost all of his characters are very dynamic and well developed and whatnot. And I feel like if he wrote today, it would be maybe 1, 2, 3 characters in the book that are very well developed, very dynamic, and then the rest of the characters might be more static and stationary characters. But those, you would know that that handful of characters that we do have would be absolutely amazing. And I think like while you guys were talking, I was trying to think of more contemporary works that I've read that would maybe fall more in line of Dostoevsky, like who he would be kind of a contemporary of. And I think it was last year or the year before that I read a book called A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles. And I absolutely loved that book. But I feel like, so the premise of the book is that our main character essentially goes on house arrest, but is in this big fancy hotel in Moscow, downtown Moscow, which is like right across the street from where he got sentenced. And it was, you know, for political reasons. And I feel like if Dostoevsky wrote today, he would write something kind of similar to that that novel where we follow the main character throughout his exile in this hotel where he's not even allowed to step outside or else a sniper will shoot him. But you get like this entire world within this one hotel. And I feel like that's the type of novel that Dostoevsky might write today compared to what he wrote back then.
Like that phone booth movie with Colin Farrell too, where he like couldn't get out of the phone booth.
Yeah.
Yeah. I also wonder too, because on top of how culturally different we are now, centuries later, also the novel as like a thing in Russian was still newish to Russia at the time.
Yeah.
You know, they had poetry, but along comes Pushkin, then Gogol, and Dostoevsky, and they start to evolve what is this novel going to be in Russian? How are we going to write and represent our culture? So I wonder too if there's just a lot more flexibility at that time as an artist with how you express your ideas, that today I wonder, with the publishing world being different and a lot more roles getting involved in writing, that can probably impact some people's ways they craft their vision. And I imagine that he would have been greatly influenced and maybe even conformed in some regards because his ideas were so big. And Sarah asked a question here: would Dostoevsky use Twitter, Facebook, or Snapchat the most? I would not follow Dostoevsky on Twitter because he would be tweeting every 5 minutes about something political that I'd just be like I'll read your book, but I don't want to follow you on Twitter because
I just wrote that Twitter would be way too limited in characters for him. He would not be.
Have like the 20 threads deep.
Yeah,
that's what I was gonna say. I'd pick Facebook because there's really not like a limit, and I don't really see him as a Snapchat kind of dude
or an Instagram person. He likes to paint his pictures with words instead of like, or you just get pictures of prisons this whole time.
I don't know if he would have been super photograph worthy. No selfies. I just can't picture it.
Yeah.
Maybe he'd show off his beard. I don't know.
Yeah, for No Shave November.
Yeah.
So what would you guys say, talking about just overall like ratings of the book? Where do you think you guys end up in terms of how did you take all the suffering, take the humor, take the political, the personal, and take the redemption? How do you cram all of that into a package of how did it make you feel? And would you recommend it? And if those are two different categories, I don't know.
I've stopped using the classic 5-star rating style, but I read this before I stopped, so I actually had a rating for this. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars because I absolutely loved reading this and the experience that it gave me and all of the introversion that it made me kind of think about. But it felt like there was some moments that were repetitive and didn't necessarily need to be in there. So I gave it 4 stars because I enjoyed it tremendously, and there's certain parts that I want to reread like all the time now. And I finished this several weeks ago now, and I still think about different moments in the book. So it's still a hugely impactful read to me, but there was certain parts that I'm like, do we really need this? Because we got a lot of other parts that were very similar to it.
Go counterclockwise, Stephanie.
I still use the 5-star system. So I'd probably give it a 4.5. Just because, like Kate said, there were a few parts that kind of dragged, but overall, I hate to use the word enjoy when there's so much horrible things in the book, but it was a really good reading experience, and it's one that's going to stick with me and one that I'll see when I reread his books in the future. Or Dead Souls, because there were Gogol references. So yeah, I really enjoyed it, and I'd recommend it to people for sure.
I could not even come up with a rating. I use the 100% system usually. And I had such a hard time rating this because it's supposed to be fictional, but it doesn't have the structure of fiction at all. Like not even like short stories really, even though it's kind of episodic. So it's almost, I don't know. I just really didn't know how to rate it, but I did enjoy it like so much. I didn't have any moments where it wasn't like, I don't know, listening intently or reading intently. And I found it very accessible. I just thought it was so great. And I would definitely recommend it to, I guess, everybody, because if you're intimidated by Russian literature, it's a good one for that. But also it would enrich your experience of Russian literature if you really enjoy Russian literature. So yeah, highly recommend.
And I think there are a lot of relatable things in here, despite it being a war camp.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of feel the same way about you guys, where it's like particularly like this October, we're doing some more horror reads, and it's like something can be really horrific, but it's like, would I recommend it to you? Like, you know, I feel like I have to separate how I personally felt, and then like I need a separate rating system of would I recommend it? You know what I mean? And for how I personally felt, I mean, I don't know. I'm gonna give it a 5 out of 5. I'm not stingy with my ratings. I love the reading of it. I also loved, to the earlier point, I don't know if I ever had a decision until just now, that I think I would put this pick 2 Dostoevsky novels, read those first, then read this. Am I choosing that because that's what I did? I don't know. Maybe I am. I don't know. But for some reason, that seems like a good idea, because it gives you the idea. You can see the scope that he can write with characters, the plotting that he can do as he brings you on a journey of just all the emotions. And I don't think he meant or wanted to do that with this, but that doesn't mean I didn't enjoy it. So as a result, I recommend this, highly recommend it. After 2 Dostoevsky novels is my final decision on that. So take that for what it's worth.
What 2 Dostoevsky novels?
I gotta read all of them before I can make that recommendation. So I'm doing all of his novels, and then I will make that decision.
It honestly depends so much on who we're talking to, because some people like Una, the brothers Karamazov was like the best thing ever, and then like other people like me, I'm like Crime and Punishment is where it's at. Like it's always gonna be my favorite, and then this one is like just super, super accessible for people who maybe didn't really enjoy either of those or wouldn't, you know. But some people really like making all the connections, and some people just want to enjoy a story. So
yeah, I think this one's really, really good for people who just want to enjoy.
Yeah.
There's not a ton of overarching themes like in his bigger books.
I think
although he does tackle certain things.
Yeah.
You can already see him tackling certain intellectual currents in this one. It's like, yep.
I would definitely
like,
give like trigger warnings if I I would recommend this to people, but I would have certain caveats like trigger warnings that come up in this, and like this is more for those like character-based readers instead of plot-driven readers, because you know a lot happens in this, like we said before, but it doesn't really have that strong of a plot line especially compared to modern fiction. So I would say, you know, there's these trigger warnings. So if any of that is problematic to you, then either don't read it or proceed with a lot of caution. And, you know, just know that this is definitely more character based than plot driven. So keep that in mind while you're reading if that's something that is an issue for you. So they have, you know, proper expectations going into it instead of just diving in and expecting a normal Russian lit novel. This is definitely not your normal Russian lit novel.
Yeah. Warning, it's Russian. It's going to be sad.
Yes, there would be pain and suffering.
And eyeball things, which I completely blocked out from the last time I read it. So gross.
Yeah.
Ugh. So yeah. So do you guys want to briefly mention your Anna K updates before we sign off?
Sure. Yeah. Oh, I've started Anna Karenina and I already love it. It's like, it is very, very easy to read. And yeah, I'm not very far into it, but I'm very gripped immediately. So yeah, I think it's going to be really good storytelling, and I think it's going to be beautiful. Yeah.
This is one of those books. So I'm about halfway into part 2 of the 8, and like already talking about it with my wife just already elevated it. Like this is a book that when you talk about it, when you hear different perspectives, like, oh, I didn't think about it from that perspective, or I wasn't thinking, like, it's one of those books that just, it's going to get better. It's like when something marinates and you come back to it the next day, you're like, how did this just get better? Like this is leftovers. That's kind of like what's happening with Anna Karenina for me is the more and more time I spend with it, the more and more I'm like, oh my gosh, it's so good.
Totally.
This is making me so happy. Anna K is like my crime and punishment for Christy.
Mhm.
A good
Um,
choice.
Yes.
I heard actually, if you ask Stephanie what's the best Dostoevsky novel to start with, she was Anna Karenina.
Yes. So that live show for you guys will be, was it November 4th?
Mm-hmm.
On Christy's channel.
4th, 7 p.m. I believe that Thursday.
Yes.
Eastern time.
And you say you guys, you're going to be there
I
too,
know.
right?
I will be there too. I will be there too. Yes.
Woo.
I'm so excited.
I'll be in recovery stage at that point, so I'm hoping to somewhere have this started either the end of this month or beginning of next month. I have the audiobook ready to go with Maggie Gyllenhaal as a narrator, and Stephanie tells me that it's thank you, Mama Richards.
Yes.
I'm told that's a very good addition. So on Thursday of next week, I'll be having shoulder surgery, so I'll be down to one arm for 6 weeks. So I've got lots of audiobooks ready to go, and this is one of them that I'm hoping to be able to slide in my ginormous
It's great on
studio.
audiobook.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. The 4 people that were in the chat.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Yes. Thank you to my co-hosts. And everyone have a great day.
Bye, guys.
Bye.